training. Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Okay, good morning, Team Krulak community. My name is Major Ian Brown. I'm the Operations Officer at the Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who can't join us today. So we'd be mindful, ask you to keep your microphones off during the presentation to avoid disrupting our speaker, as well as keep your cameras off to help us stream it out smoothly. We will have a question and answer following the presentation. So as Mr. Corbett's going along, if you do have a question, just go ahead and type it into the chat. And when he's done, I'll call on you in the order questions are received and have you ask your question directly. So today we're very happy to welcome one of our neighbors here aboard Quantico. Mr. Art Corbett is a retired Marine Corps infantry officer with 31 years of commissioned service who commanded at every rank and retired in 2009. He is a graduate of the Navy War College, the Army War College, and the Marine Corps School of Advanced Warfighting. He currently serves as a concept developer at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, where he develops future operating concepts for the Marine Corps and Naval Service. His current focus areas include expeditionary advanced base operations and stand-in forces and logistics subsidiary concepts. Today, he'll be discussing an area near and dear to our work here at the Krulak Center, the military innovator's dilemma. All right, sir, with that, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Ian. And again, I'd like to thank the Krulak Center for hosting this. I appreciate your hard work in coordinating it, and Colonel Jackson for allowing me to address this group concerning something that concerns me, which is our approach towards innovation. I've entitled this brief "The Military Innovator's Dilemma," and that's with due apologies to Clayton Christensen, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma. But I think that what I want to be able to express is how we too are in a dilemma here between our ability to innovate to support the fight for tonight and our ability to appropriately and properly plan for the future. So, it's the responsibility of those of us who are in the future military force development business to understand and explain how the new capabilities that we advocate and develop will be used in new ways to provide future decision makers with better strategic options. So of necessity, this discussion is a bit difficult to scope, and it will range from innovation and tactical capability to the strategic ends that they're designed to enable. So this is a rather holistic discussion designed to ultimately inform our many reductionist efforts so that we can operate cogently and coherently together. So to refine our scope, what I like to do is use the Commandant's planning guidance to focus our efforts. So the very title of this brief contains the explicit assertion that we face a dilemma. Again, I believe that dilemma involves temporal distinctions that we really don't understand, or to the degree that we do understand them, we are not dealing with them very well. By making conscious trade-offs and important distinctions between near-term, fight tonight, improvisation efforts to maintain current readiness, and future force disruptive innovation requirements to restore the strategic initiative. So this brief will not resolve this dilemma, but it will make the trade-offs more apparent and provide advocacy for a long view approach. So explicit in the title slide here is the Commandant's planning guidance ambition to restore the strategic initiative. The Commandant's planning guidance is startlingly unique in that it virtually stands alone among DoD directives in identifying the initiative as the proper ambition of future force development, or particularly military future force development and design. In all competitions, there are the actors who initiate novel means and unexpected method, and reactors who respond, parry, and improvise to deal creatively with the innovations the actors have developed or unleashed. The Commandant's planning guidance is a clear declaration of the Marine Corps' ambition to gain and maintain the actor role in future force development. In short, we want our adversaries to dance to the tune that we play. Vice, our force development processes reactively focusing on improvising to counter adversary initiatives. So lastly, our title slide peeks at why we may be fumbling the ball and why, despite great experience and exorbitant expenditure, we find ourselves in reaction mode to a novice power. Our failure to understand paradigm shifts and the human phenomena in military innovation that settles for improvement, vice striving for disruption, renders our most diligent efforts a wasteful expenditure of scarce resources. And the most precious commodity of the between war years, which is time, is blithely expended. So here's the specific words from the Commandant's planning guidance. These words capture the fundamental, unique, and energizing message of the CPG, but they're little understood, and consequently, they largely go unimplemented. Institutions and individuals, long conditioned to conformity, procedure, and defined mission sets, are redirected by the CPG to create a new, disruptive, and highly competitive space. Our efforts, he says, must be more aggressive and present new options to future decision makers. New, not better capabilities are required if we are to gain the initiative. And even how we define the battle space, confined seas, requires a new perspective. There is ample material in just this short paragraph to engage a very meaningful discussion for a 2-hour seminar at MCU. But the word that is most relevant to our discussion on innovation is disruptive. Because without disruption in naval means, method, or some combination of the both, we cannot restore the strategic initiative in future force development. The Commandant's planning guidance directs many specific actions, but without a basic understanding of why disruptive innovation is a prerequisite ambition, our many efforts at improvement will remain disconnected from our overarching requirement to restore the initiative. So I call this the cacophony slide, because this is what I think we hear right now in terms of innovation within DoD. We speak frequently of our ambitions and efforts towards innovation, even as we watch our deterrent capabilities erode in the face of adversary military initiatives, advances, innovations, and investments, and we realize that we must do something different. So DoD is replete with innovation initiatives. But military innovation is not an incantation, nor does it occur for the want of it. Nor can an innovation culture be simply directed. Military innovation thrives when it is least fettered by process, but it has to enable coherent action. Innovation requires that innovators have a common vision. They have a common lexicon, and they have an appreciation for the distinctions between improvisation, sustaining innovation, and disruptive innovation. So, I think that, everybody talks about innovation, and I found this slide and I thought it was pretty appropriate. Innovation is a vague, mostly useless term, and in many cases obscures what we're really trying to accomplish. In other words, innovate to do what? Somebody's got to explain we're looking for a better mousetrap. So this slide refers to logistics, but Ernie King apparently said this back in World War II, and I think it applies today to innovation. I don't know what this logistics is that Marshall's talking about, but I want some of it. I think that largely that's our approach to innovation, is that we know we're behind the power curve here, that in great power competition we have an ever weakening hand, We have to do something about it, but lacking a clear understanding of what that is, we talk about innovation. So the first thing I like to do is to start with some definitions. And we have to appreciate the distinction between these three types of innovation. And I wish to do that without disparaging any of them. Improvisation, okay, is remarkably important. You know, the activity of making or doing something not planned beforehand, using whatever can be found. It's an essential military skill. It's what enables us to adapt and overcome. Now, that's different from sustaining innovation, which are substantive improvements to the current force and its capabilities or methods. It involves continuous evolution, but its continuity is one of the things that we like, because the competencies that enabled us to work, say, for example, a ship, a submarine, or a tank, are all usually relevant in the newer, better, improved submarine, ship, or tank. And then lastly is disruptive innovation. And this implies discontinuities. These are game-changing innovations to the means and methods that compel the adversary to dramatically rethink his force posture and structure in light of new capabilities or methods. So we have to appreciate that what our adversaries have done, particularly the PRC with A2AD capabilities, has been highly disruptive to our long-established force structure and to the joint force in general. What they have done is proven to be disruptive and has put us in a state of reaction. So here's some particular examples of each of these, and they're all important. And I come back to the fact that I don't wish to disparage in any way any of these different forms of innovation, because they're all important. This is during World War II, despite the fact that every British schoolboy had summered in Normandy in France, and despite the fact that we had thousands of aerial photographs, Bocage country surprised us. And when we hit the Bocage, these many stone walls that girded the fields about every 100 yards around in France, when our tanks tried to climb over them, they exposed their underbelly and were taken out by simple infantry-carried Panzerfausts. So a U.S. Army sergeant went down to the Normandy beach and did basic farm boy innovation and welded some of those pieces of steel to the front of a tank so that the tank could bust through the Bocage rather than going over it. And it's a classic example of fielded forces conducting improvisation. So sustaining innovation, the USS Nautilus, the first submarine, and no doubt the Nautilus was a tremendous improvement, nuclear power, a tremendous improvement over previous submarines. However, submarines continue to do what submarines did, but they could do it much better. So this is a good example of sustaining innovation, necessary to be able to maintain superiority once you achieve it. Now, nuclear weapons. This is disruptive innovation. This changes the game. Now, not every disruptive innovation needs to be as dramatic, as powerful, or as lethal as nuclear weapons. But what they have to do is they have to have the ability to roll the enemy back in terms of his force development process and make it so that he begins to respond to you rather than you responding to him. So military innovation is much more than the aggregate benefit of many new ideas and capabilities. Of course, a persistent process of improvement is beneficial in any competitive process. But when simply finding new bright lights might not illuminate the path chosen to best yield advantage, that's when you find yourself in a paradigm shift. Simply asking for generic innovation will ultimately only yield 360-degree innovation. But DoD cannot afford to innovate everything and still achieve the necessary velocity and focus required in a competitive environment like force development and war. Our innovation efforts should be simultaneously opportunistic, focused, and disruptive. So what helps us here to achieve that is vision. Innovation occurs with greater velocity when guided by a broad vision. Vision is not specific direction. Rather, it provides a cardinal direction that envisions a new strategic condition that satisfies the competitive strategic imperatives of the age. When President Kennedy said, "A man on the moon by the end of the decade," he both focused and unleashed the competitive instincts of an innovative people. Understanding where they wanted to go, otherwise disassociated organizations and people could then form new associations and relationships without specific direction to accomplish the commonly understood objective. And this is the role that vision serves. The vision we need to accelerate our velocity of innovation within DoD is a similar combination of analysis to determine our strategic imperatives and synthesis to discern how we can meet them with new ways and new means to bend the character of the competition to our advantage. This has to be, again, opportunistic in the sense that once we set the path, we're willing to veer in order to take advantage of what we discover along the way and new capabilities in many different venues. At the same time, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that we are trying to create a disruptive new competitive space. And that allows us then to focus our efforts in that they're guided by a vision focused on willfully bending the character of future war in a direction which is commonly understood to offer advantage to ourselves and our allies. And ultimately, they must be disruptive in that they contribute to gaining and maintaining the strategic initiative. Collectively, our efforts must meet the demands of the strategic imperatives. So one of the things that we did was we began to take a look at business innovation. And I already mentioned Clayton Christensen, who has a lot of great ideas in the business world regarding innovation. And the title of this brief, of course, we borrowed from him. So this brief is a synthesis of ideas regarding innovation based on both military history and a contemporary analysis of business innovation theories. As a highly entrepreneurial people, Americans are rightly embarrassed that an autocratic nation, which has gained economic might largely through proprietary intellectual theft and derivative ideas in manufacturing, has managed to achieve the strategic initiative in great power competition. So our question is, what can industry teach us about innovation? To that end, we've shamelessly plagiarized and then adapted leading ideas and examples from business to our strategic competition. We found the insights of Clayton Christensen particularly noteworthy. We recognize business parallels are inexact, but we compelled ourselves to try and find relevant outliers, understand and adapt those metaphors in order to develop useful insights. And this is important because corporations face constant competition in the marketplace and are compelled to understand the nature of the competition or go bankrupt. The consequences for military innovation are more existential, but the engagements are far less frequent. Archaic and fanciful conceptions of the nature of the competition can endure well past shelf life. Reflexive efforts to win the last war, vice the next, are more than apocryphal. How we contextualize and understand the nature of the competition based on an accurate appraisal of the capabilities relative to the strategic imperatives determines our appreciation of the essence of the competition. In both business and military innovation, the crux variable is human nature, not technology. How and where should we focus our innovation efforts then becomes our leading question. So a particularly salient source of business insight worthy of our attention can be found in the Blockbuster versus Netflix competition, as it reveals important insights into the differences between sustaining and disruptive innovation, and will well serve as an apt metaphor for military innovation amid the discontinuities created by paradigm shifts. Blockbuster comes to dominate the video rental market by assuring the customer that they had capacity. The capacity needed to supply the latest videos by virtue of having a big box store. They well met the new market demand fueled by the home VCR. But much of the revenue stream, about 40%, also came from late fees, penalties that encouraged the refresh of the supply, but at the same time annoyed the customer. Netflix founder was dissatisfied with an extended late fee and determined to disrupt and surpass the dominant market leader with a new business model, initially based on internet ordering of mailed video discs. This model takes advantage of growing access to dial-up internet, but it was just a market entry point, with the ultimate vision for a far more technically disruptive product and business model premised on fiber optics-based broadband technology. Their initial model sustained a multi-year profit loss, but Netflix remained confident in ultimately reaching an inflection point that would tilt market opportunity and demand. The technical innovation was the expansion of the fiber optic cable. The new business model was subscription. And what's worth noting here is Clayton points out that genuine disruption is usually a combination of both technology and business model. For us, that would be both new technical means as well as new operational method. So this is a timeline of the denouement of Blockbuster and the ascendancy of Netflix. Blockbuster responded to the competition with a bad case of human nature, leavened by the hubris of current market dominance and a concomitant failure to understand the change in the nature and the essence of the competition. Rather than attempting to surpass the Netflix challenge with an equally disruptive technical and/or business model innovation of their own, Blockbuster doubled down on what they knew and what had yielded success to date. They worked at creating a better big box store. What about new rugs? How about a better logo or a bigger picture window? Or even worse, you could sell popcorn. Finally, they began to realize they needed to reduce late fees. But at that point, Netflix had already a grip on the market. Blockbuster failed to understand that what Netflix had done was to initiate a paradigm shift, a change in fundamental assumptions concerning how customers would access and pay for home entertainment. Netflix had no need to pay for the internet fiber optic cable construction, no maintenance for big box stores, no personnel required to restock shelves or to man point of rental and rental booths. The change to a subscription business model ensured a steady stream of revenue without the customer alienating late fees. Innovations in both technology and business model ensured the end of Blockbuster's market dominance. Now, Blockbuster knew about Netflix, but they still did not understand that the nature of the competition had changed. And Blockbuster laughed at Netflix's offer to buy them out for $5 million in 2000, just before Netflix hit its inflection point. By then, Blockbuster was in Chapter 11 bankruptcy within a decade. Netflix is now a $6 billion a year enterprise. Too late, Blockbuster learned what we can glean as our first big insight for military innovation from business. When contending with paradigm-shifting competitors, better current capability and method is no longer better. Only different is better. And the more different, the more likely the innovation will be disruptive enough to be genuinely advantageous. Blockbuster's efforts to create a better big box store and to improvise with the fixed infrastructure it had created as part of its fast waning business model wastefully expended the capital and seed corn needed to become like a Hulu or to originate some other more competitive business model. Blockbuster understood the competition as movie rental business, whereas Netflix had purposefully recontextualized the character of the competition as better, quote unquote, home entertainment. So, what did business learn? These business lessons were gleaned from an internet article discussing Netflix ascendancy in the market. But I believe that there is much more for us to learn from this business metaphor. We will tease out some of these lessons in turn, but first, I'd like to note that allowing competitors to define the context of the competition can be a formula for self-extinction. In the face of a disruptive competitor, reflexive adherence to conventional means and method, even if it's improved, is likely to result in being defined out of the new context of competition which they impose. This is why dictating the strategic initiative is all important and the proper objective of our force development ambitions. From the standpoint of military and naval forces, it is important to distinguish between the habits associated with long-evolved means, methods, and missions, and the more enduring fundamental requirements associated with achieving the strategic initiative and meeting the strategic imperatives of the era. So something else that I'd like to mention here are two other aspects of the competition. Velocity is the speed with which you innovate, and it pertains to both disruptive and sustaining innovation. And the other aspect of it is surprise, because really that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to put our adversary in a condition of unpreparedness, which results in surprise. And surprise is a condition that can be inflicted on an adversary, right? And he remains afflicted by that until he figures out some means or method of dealing with it. So a good example, I think, from history is the Monitor and the Merrimack. You know, the Merrimack enjoyed one day of tactical and operational dominance in Hampton Roads as it went around poking holes in wooden ships. The next day, when the Monitor arrived and it matched the capabilities that the Merrimack had, it pretty much obviated the advantage that they had created. What becomes important here is an understanding that what we're trying to do is to create a more extended duration of surprise through our disruption. And disruptive innovation has a greater opportunity of both achieving surprise as well as extending the duration of surprise. So just a few definitions here that we've talked about. You know, the strategic initiative, particularly in terms of force development, is you have it when your adversary is responding to you and your initiatives rather than you responding to his. Force improvisation is a very necessary skill by fielded forces in particular so that they can deal with surprise and the many forces that the enemy and nature might throw at them on the battle space. Sustaining innovation is those things that enable us to constantly improve so that we can maintain advantage with fielded forces. Disruptive innovation, though, is what's necessary to either create or to deal with paradigm shifts. When you're not only going to get better at the game you play, but with malice aforethought, you decide you're going to change the game because you're better at playing football than baseball. Now, we'll talk in a couple minutes about the strategic imperatives, but these are what we must focus on. We can't just simply innovate to innovate for innovation's sake. We must innovate in a direction that enables us to not only gain the initiative in force development, but those developments will enable us to achieve our strategic objectives. So let me make a few assertions here that I think are important. And we need to understand in terms of how we approach innovation in future force development. Paradigm shifts disrupt the character of the competition. They change the metrics of success, and they render the evolved force development processes obsolete. Because in many cases, what you find is that you can field a force that's going to do the classic, perhaps apocryphal, but nevertheless classic Polish cavalry charge against the German tank. Some folks did not yet realize that farriers and mule skinners were a thing of the past. We have trouble differentiating improvisation, sustaining innovation, and disruption. Now, understanding that they are all important, we nevertheless have to make sure that we are covering the field and we are not all focused on the improvisation efforts to support the Marine and the sailor who's in the field in the fight tonight competition. It's very important that we support him, and it's very important that we go about doing everything we can to maintain current force readiness and capability sets. However, if we put all our energies and efforts into that, we become like 5-year-olds playing soccer. Everybody's on that single ball and nobody's playing position, which means that we will be perpetually reactive. What we need to ensure is that some portion of the force development process is working hard to create the disruptive capability sets that are going to be necessary to first bend the character of war in the direction we want it to go. And then secondly, having done that, being able to capitalize on those changes. So our force development and design activities currently remain largely near-term and reactive. We continue to try to close gaps taken from IPLs from current fielded forces. And this idea of closing gaps rather than generating opportunities will put us in a position where we remain reactive. Disruption is essential to regaining the strategic initiative in force development, and we need to aim some portion of our force development process at creating disruption. For one reason is that our current competitive space, based on large ship industrial base, is increasingly untenable. The question, considering who builds ships in the world today, what makes us think that a war predicated on the risk, expenditure, and replacement of ships remains a competitive space for the United States is very important. If that's not a competitive space, and you would be hard-pressed to explain how it might be, then it's important we understand that we intentionally bend the character of war in a direction that favors us, which I would argue is to push us into push war into the innovation base where we can still dominate. One of the things we've got to pull out from the business end of all this is disruption involves both means and method. They describe it as technology and business model. For us, it's technology and methodology. A good example of methodology heavy would be blitzkrieg. A good example of technology heavy would be nuclear weapons. The sweet spot is the combination of the two, and we see many examples of that throughout history. What we have to also appreciate is disruption isn't just gonna happen. It's not fortuitous. It's the fruit of a vision that focuses our efforts. So our disruptive vision must be informed by the contemporary strategic imperatives, those things that we must accomplish in order to meet our strategic goals. Now, I fully understand, however, that we are in a dilemma between our ability to maintain current readiness and also prepare for the future. So what we want to talk about here just a little bit is an appreciation for force development in periods of paradigm shifts are different than force development is probably for 100 years until those paradigm shifts happen. Because you can continue to make a better cavalry unit with lighter horseshoes, better saddles, but once that internal combustion engine comes along, now you find yourself in a period of discontinuity. And what you have to appreciate is the new assumptions about your force, the new advantages you can achieve, the new competencies you have to develop, and the many changes that are going to occur in the character and the nature of the character of the competition. Right now, we are facing an adversary initiated paradigm shift, based largely on the range, accuracy, quantity of their long-range precision fires against our fixed infrastructure and large ships, essentially a very brittle target set. Our objective should be for us to initiate the next paradigm shift based on meeting the strategic imperatives and doing so with our innovation base, understanding the withered nature of our industrial base. So our ambition should necessarily be, and it concerns me that we really have not focused on how we are going to bend the character of future war in a direction that favors our national strengths and those of our allies. Our approach to the future must be proactive, not pondering what will happen, but deliberately bending the character of war through creative force development. So this idea of bending the character of future war, I mentioned earlier, our current method and our industrial base is inadequate. Now, that's not to say that we are in any way industrially disarmed, but I go back to that question, considering, the nations who build ships, the PRC, for example, is #1 in the world. We don't even make the top 10. Then we have to appreciate that that is not a competitive space that we would want to fight in. We become much like Japan at the beginning of World War II, where we have a superlative Navy that we cannot replace against an adversary who can consistently replace his Navy. So what we have to appreciate is that we want to shift the nature of the competition into a direction where we are inherently more competitive, away from the withered industrial base and more towards our ever-advancing innovation base. So what this slide's designed to depict is the need for vision that provides us a focal point for how we are going to innovate in order to achieve our strategic ends. And that vision needs to be a disruptive vision, intentionally disruptive, so that we regain the strategic initiative and we stop shooting behind the duck, if you will, to use a metaphor. Now, we also wanted to make it so that the strategic imperatives are associated with what we see as our theory of success. And we would define that here as the ability to protect our treaty allies and partners from insult to their sovereignty, and the requisite force, capability, and capacity to first deter war, and then, if necessary, thwart aggression in great power competition. So what I've done here is made an attempt to list what I believe are the strategic imperatives. I would not claim that this is in any way a definitive list, but what we have to do certainly are these things, because what our adversaries have done with their force development process is to make these very difficult. We need to be able to maintain persistent forward presence, long the claim and brag of the United States Navy and the Marine Corps. We need to do that so that we can meet treaty obligations to defend allies and partners. We need to be able to create military capability and capacity to provide credible, conventional deterrence at affordable cost. And I would argue that one of the problems we have right now with our sustaining innovation efforts is they draw us to try to increase long-range precision fires that ultimately we will not be able to afford in the capacity we need at a cost we can afford. So we also want to empower our allies, not merely protect them, so that they can better defend their own territorial sovereignty. And we want more nuanced options as we confront aggression. We're not trying to precipitate World War III. So we're looking for a force that puts more rungs on our escalatory ladder. Lastly, we want to make sure that we can generate military conditions that are highly coercive, but not necessarily vertically escalatory. Now, these are my nominations for the strategic imperatives. Others might be able to add to these, but I would say that these are both fundamental and minimal strategic imperatives that our future force design would be designed to meet. So this brings us to the military innovator's dilemma. We must remain ready to fight tonight, and we must create a disruptive new force that will restore the strategic initiative. We have to acknowledge risk in this process of doing both. We have to understand, though, that if we consume all our seed corn that should go to the future in contemporary readiness, and if we allow the O&M costs of maintaining current platforms and capabilities not to give us the bandwidth that we need in terms of both intellectual bandwidth, cognitive work, and our ability to purchase what we need, that's going to put us in a position of perpetually being reactive. So some final thoughts. We understand that change is inevitable. Change has already been foisted upon us. My concern is that we have reacted by doing improvisation efforts for the most part and some sustaining innovation efforts. But only the CPG identifies the proper focus of our efforts, which is that what we want to be able to do is to create the disruption that's going to make it so that our erstwhile adversaries are going to be deterred by the fact that we have created new capability sets that rock them on their heels, that make it so they have to adjust, and that we begin to play the tune that they dance to. And what we have to understand, we are the masters of our fate, and we can change the character of the competition. We have to look for the opportunities to build the force that will meet the strategic imperatives rather than reflexively closing gaps. This is what causes us to shoot behind the duck, if you will. We shoot behind the duck because we aim behind the duck. We're reactive. We need to become proactive and force our adversaries to be reactive to us. We know that when you are in desperate need of disruptive innovation, when you find yourself in the position that Blockbuster was in, when better is no longer better. A better big block store was not going to enable them to compete against the fiber optic cable that Netflix was exploiting. And when better isn't better, and only different is better, then the more different, the more better. And that's what disruption is all about. And that's what disruption and disruptive innovation is all about, and why we should be desperately seeking the new vision for how we are going to get on the disruptive side of the paradigm shift. So with that, Ian, what I'd like to do is to stop the presentation. I have, as you well know, a number of concepts, things like expeditionary advanced base operations, concepts like stand-in forces that I think fit the bill for how we go about meeting those strategic imperatives. My great concern is that I'm willing to take these contentious, but nevertheless, I believe, credible ideas into the arena and to argue with and against others. The idea of thesis antithesis, giving a synthesis that would even be better than what the contenders would bring to that arena. The problem is when you walk in the arena for disruptive innovation, not only are there no other contenders, but there's no spectators. No one right now is focused on the fact that only by creating a disruptive new competitive force will we be able to restore the strategic initiative as directed by the CPG. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, great. Thank you very much, sir. And to everyone who is online right now, if you do have a question for Mr. Corbett, just go ahead and you can start entering them in the chat, and I'll call on you as I get them. But I do have a couple of things I just jotted down to get the Q&A kind of going. So first, it's kind of a two-part question. But talking about the importance of you got to have a vision to sort of drive to guide your innovation efforts. Do you think it's possible that a sort of a democratic or a Western society like ours, where you have regular changes in who's building the vision, right? Like we just had one yesterday, right? Is it possible to develop a disruptive vision, a coherent vision that you can plan to when that possibly shifts depending on what political element is in power? And also, do you think our innovation base is agile enough to adjust to those shifts in vision as it's currently constructed?
Yeah, so my belief is that the strategic imperatives drive us towards what I right now see as a fairly narrow path. When you take a look at the requirements, to maintain persistent naval forward presence, in my mind, and certainly in the concepts that I advance, I think that leads us to that more resilient forward-facing infrastructure that I call an EAB. Now, there might be some other way of achieving that. Whatever that might be, I'm happy to argue, debate the relative merits, right? But as long as persistent naval forward presence is a strategic imperative, we need some way of meeting that. Then, for example, how are we going to stand force with a force that provides us the capacity we need at a cost we can afford? What that tells me is that sustaining innovation efforts to create ever more long-range precision fires can only be done with ever greater cost. And we already are busting at the seams, if you will, in terms of our ability to simply maintain things like the fleet that we have today. So I think what we're going to find is that the strategic imperatives serve to shape the nature of our response. But what we have to also appreciate is that we have to put a marker out there for where we're trying to go. So I believe it will become less contentious when we begin to realize that the path there is ever more obvious.
All right, thank you. And then I got one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to what's going on in the chat right now. But kind of going to that last slide where you talked about the military innovators dilemma. It's that choice, right? You know, planning for the fight tonight, that you have certain obligations that you have to be ready to go do, versus disrupting toward the future. You know, bending the character of war into something that's more advantageous for you. How does one, you know, do that or solve that dilemma without potentially creating a gap either one way or the other that an adversary who's paying attention to, you know, what you're doing can possibly exploit?
Now, so I'm not sure that can be done. I believe that we have to accept risk. We have to appreciate that we are going to have to accept risk. That the ability to be at the top of our game to fight tonight and our ability to be fully ready for the future is probably exceeds the allocation of funds that we are going to get. So we are going to have to find a way of conducting this metamorphosis, if you will. You know, how do you go from the caterpillar to the butterfly, and do it in such a way that that we don't lose our ability to constructively deter. Now, at the same time, though, if we measure our force success by its ability to deter, we see that we are fast waning and we need to accelerate the pace of change. So using that as the criteria, I would argue that the faster we make that change, the better it is that we do it. Now, there's many arguments to be made as to where we place our efforts here. My concern is that right now, no one is effectively advocating for that future vision. No one is effectively advocating for how we deal with this paradigm shift in a way that our objective is to reclaim the strategic initiative. For the most part, what you take a look at when you read our documents, and it's the CPG being a notable exception, and I would also argue perhaps General Brown of the Air Force, when he assumed command, his thesis statement, if you will, which talks about the need for radical change as well. Those two documents pretty much stand alone in terms of identifying this idea of resecuring the strategic initiative in force development as the direction that we need to go. So I want to make sure that we spread the players on the field in such a way that not everybody's on the ball, and that we can have a ball to pass into the future and be able to deal with it effectively.
All right, great, thank you. With that, I'm going to start turning it over to the questions coming in through the chat. First up is from our director at the Krulak Center, Ms. Valerie Jackson. Ma'am, are you able to ask your question?
Yeah, I am. Thanks. Thanks again, Art. So you may or may not be able to see it in the chat there, but could it be that we're just not seeing some of these disruptive activities because they're classified? And to what extent are we trying to balance the free and open society that we have with the ability to surprise our adversary, and perhaps this is part of the game, if you will, with announcing force design changing in the CPG and all that, with open activities vice ones that are classified. So creating reactions in both those dimensions, sort of simultaneously. So appreciate it.
Yeah, I think your question is, do we have something like the Manhattan Project up our sleeve someplace that we're ready and willing and able to pull out of our sleeve when required? So to my knowledge, first, no. and talking to other people who ought to know, there are many technical improvements in the hopper, but we have to appreciate that. I go back to this: they're not genuine disruption is not usually a matter of technology alone. It's the combination of new technology and new method, much like Blitzkrieg was. I think at the operational level of war, if we are going to regain a strategic initiative, short of things like nuclear weapons, I believe that what we're going to find is it's going to become ever more necessary to combine means and method to create that disruption. Now, we can look at things like hypersonics, and no doubt, they were significant improvement in terms of long-range fires. Then we also have to look at cost, and this element of cost is something that we have to strongly consider. The idea that the nation is, willfully going to trade off prosperity in order to create deterrence, I don't think that's going to sell well, and I don't think it's going to become a reality. What I think is going to be necessary is we need to find a new methodology that enables us to get the capacity we need at the cost we can afford. But to also answer your question more optimistically, perhaps, I hope so. I hope that there's a secret Manhattan Project that I'm not aware of. But that said, I believe that we need to have publicly stated documents that focus on our force development processes and encourage them to recapture the strategic initiative in force development. Because we're spending a lot of money dancing to the tune that the PRC and other great powers have given us now, and it would be much better to see them adapting to us.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, sir. Our next question is from our deputy at the Krulak Center, Lieutenant Colonel Zepeda. Sir, are you able to ask your question?
Yes, sir. So part of my question is referencing the Kill Chain book by Christian Bros and T-AI by Michael Kagan, and some of the other things that I've come across. So specifically, can you articulate the impact, when we start considering technologies such as AI and machine learning, what impact those technologies can have when instantiated would allow our legacy platforms and systems to not only talk to each other, but also share information to create a new form of information that can be utilized, whether it's in a weaponized fashion or otherwise, to inform the Marine soldier or sailor on the ground. Over.
Yeah, so I think that those kind of sustaining innovations in terms of communications can greatly, communication C2 and the many things that AI can do for us with the current force can help give us a better current force. There's no doubt about that. But I believe that what was the fiber optic cable for Netflix for us is going to be autonomous platforms and systems. And I think that AI applied to how we utilize and exploit these smaller, cheaper, more risk-worthy, and more widely proliferated systems using and exploiting the capabilities of AI would be much more useful application of those kind of technologies than trying to improvise with the current force. So I fully acknowledge the potential for AI, but I would prefer to see our efforts with AI more focused on the future force than improvisational efforts with the current force.
All right. Thank you. So I got there's a Mr. Bill Tomeo put a statement in.
think Ian just dropped off and froze up.
Manpower management model as opposed to, whatever the Netflix manpower. So do you, what are some of your on whether the Marine Corps is sort of that disruptive innovation, and if it is locked into that, what changes do you think would need to be made to, the talent management piece, which is talked about in the Commandant's planning guidance, to get us toward that disruptive innovation arc?
Yeah, so you were kind of breaking in and out of there, Ian, as you were relaying the question, but I think I got the gist of it. And talent management, I keep coming back to this idea of competencies, and this is one of the reasons. Blockbuster had a bad case of human nature. They had developed competencies in how to run and manage big block stores. We have long developed competencies in the capabilities we have today. And to create the talent management we need to acquire new competencies is going to be very difficult. It's going to be internally disruptive. And that ability to accept internal disruption is also one of the reasons that, it's the reason some businesses go away. But we have got to be able to buckle down. And I think, the Commandant took the first step. So there's some MOSs that used to exist in the Marine Corps and some capabilities that no longer exist. It's not doing that because those capabilities and competencies were worth less, but he's looking to acquire new capabilities and competencies that are going to be worth more. But they are disruptive. And that disruption is not only what it does on the adversary, but you can also, in many cases, measure what it does to us. So I believe, talent management, this is going to do this right, okay, is going to shake the bones of the Marine Corps and the Joint Force. But better to shake the bones before the fight and be ready for the future rather than to be picking ourselves up and wondering what happened to us.
All right, thank you. And hopefully I'm not glitching anymore because I want to turn it over next to Dr. Brandon Valeriano. He's our Bren Chair for Military Innovation at the Krulak Center, and he's got a question for you. And we'll, looking at the time, we'll make this the last question before we wrap up. So Dr. Valeriano, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for the talk. It was great. I'm over here writing, and I keep turning around. I keep getting pulled back in. I wanted to ask you about, and I was very pleased about your discussion about the impact of costs on innovation. And I would really like to hear more reflections on this. So the question is basically, why do strategists and innovators not really consider the impact of costs, or say bureaucratic intransigence, or or metrics and operational research in the consideration of innovation? I think a lot of people have made very big bets on things like cyber and hypersonics without really understanding the utility and efficacy of said weapons as they relate to costs or the impact and course of events. So why do these things get ignored so often?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And to hear, I mentioned that we kind of looked hard at what we could learn from industry. And this is where Clayton Christensen and his Innovator's Dilemma in Business, I think, sheds what I would call not directly parallel light, but good insights. One of the things he does is he points out that now he uses two examples. One's cars. His big example, though, is with steel. And he talks about how small steel companies were able to disrupt the steel market because they entered making something called, rebar, which is comparatively cheap, easily made steel. And the major steel companies were happy to give away that portion of the market because it had low returns. And the investors were glad to see that because they were going to get higher returns from things like rolled steel. Now, we saw this same thing in cars, right? Where, the American companies were looking to make bigger, more expensive cars, but foreign companies were willing to introduce things like, the VW Beetle and some of the beaters that I used to drive back in college. So what we see is that there's a discrepancy between market forces and investor desires. The market, in many cases, has a hunger for the cheap and the many, whereas investors are looking for return on investment. Now, I would argue we have a similar type phenomena going on in the quote-unquote military-industrial complex, in that we'd rather drive a bigger, more able ship. We would rather drive a better, bigger tank. And what we see is that we keep pushing the capabilities we have in a direction where they're ever more exquisite, ever more expensive, ever fewer, and we lack the numbers we need in order to be able to make them operationally relevant. In the meantime, the market forces on the battlefield introduce things like penetrator plates that make it so that improvised explosive devices are more effective against our vehicles. And ultimately, we end up trying to react to and respond to those market forces. So we didn't really have time in this short brief to really skin the cat on the many things that we learned from the innovators. But what we see is there's a parallel there. We keep wanting to have the more exquisite and expensive, and the market is going to keep driving us. I say the market, the parallel being military realities, driving us to the need for the many and the adequate in terms of capability. So I think our failure to understand cost perhaps is this belief that we're going to have an infinite well that we're going to be able to dip into, and that we have not in many years faced an economic peer competitor as well as a military peer competitor. We have to understand the depth of resources that China has relative to our own depth of resources. And that's the reason I believe that wallowing in ever more long-range precision fires capabilities is going to prove unaffordable relative to the capacity we need to effectively deter a nation like China. So I believe that we have to understand that in many cases, we are part of the problem here, that we, the military, need to appreciate the benefits of the many and the adequate and not always go to the hyper exquisite and hyper expensive if we're going to get the capacity we need at a cost we could afford to make deterrence a reality. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. No, I think that was a great note to end on here for today's session. And to Mr. Art Corbett, again, thank you for joining us today and keeping our 2021 season going strong. To everyone out in the audience, thank you as well for joining us this week on the Brewcast. We expect to be off next week, but keep your eyes open for announcements for our next Brewcast, looking at February 4th, where we'll be hosting a unique panel of experts focusing on DIME, our allies and partners, and the South China Sea region. We'll see you all then.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.